Welcome to the Catacombic Machine. I am Josef, and this is episode number 2. Last time around, I spoke to philosopher Peter Sjöstedt Age about his book Numismatics. We talked about Nietzsche and Bergson and Whitehead and neo-nihilism, and judging from the responses, it was a good conversation. Peter is an interesting guy. We even talked about making another episode about the connection between philosophy and popular culture, because if you didn't pick up on it, Marvel has created a superhero named Karnak, which is inspired by Peter's philosophy. That's pretty cool. So he'd be the perfect guest for such an episode. That's something to look forward to. I want to say thank you to those of you who have chosen to support the podcast on Patreon. For those of you who haven't, go to patreon.com/thecatacombic and support me. And if you do, and if you donate $3 per episode, you'll be granted access to TCM Extra. That's the Catacombic Machine Extra, a special little show just for those with ears to hear, just for the chosen ones. And how do you become one of the chosen ones? Well, it's simple. You donate $3 per episode. I'm not going to tell you too much about what TCM Extra will be about, partly because I don't know yet, and in part because it's just for those who donate. It's just for the patrons. In today's episode, I will share a conversation with a friend of mine. His name's Aron Flam. He is a stand-up comedian, one of Sweden's finest. He is a political satirist and he adores Friedrich Nietzsche. So we talk about Nietzsche and the connection to comedy. Nietzsche as this comedian who rants against everything and everyone. We also talk a little bit about Deleuze, which stems from previous unpublished conversations between me and Aron. Aron also referred, I think, to Alexander Bard at one point or two, since the two of them have talked about the individual. Alexander wants to get rid of the individual. He wants to talk about individuals. But Aron is suspicious. So that comes up too. That's just for context. We also talk about Sweden and feminism and antisemitism. It's a sort of crazy, zigzagging episode, and I hope that you'll like it. So let's get to it. This is Aron Flam. I was thinking about the Jungian archetype, the trickster, and how that archetype might be a good way to enter into your mind.
I adore Trickster. Well, I don't adore Trickster, but I think I adored the Messiah myth when I was a child, and then I discovered that my life was more comparable to the myth of the Trickster than to the myth of the Messiah.
The Trickster, I said it's a Jungian archetype, and I've heard you talk about this, so maybe you can introduce the listeners who has perhaps never heard of the Trickster. Who is the Trickster, and why is the Trickster an interesting character to identify oneself with?
I started out by mentioning the Messiah myth, and it's a good place to start because the Messiah myth, in some respects, is a story about man's desire to become God or godlike. And the Trickster is more of a staple character in the hero drama. He is Morpheus in the Matrix. He's the one who takes the hero from the normal, mundane world of everyday existence and into the world of the great adventure. So it is a character who can walk between worlds. But Trickster always, I think that Trickster has his own myth as well. Because one of the things that is recurring in most Messiah myths is that you never get to learn anything about the hero's childhood. And I think this is where we find the myth of the Trickster, because I think if the hero myth is the story of how man becomes God, then the trickster myth is the story of how an animal becomes human. Because the myth of the trickster is usually the story of a clown. It's someone who is driven by their impulses and can't resist its hunger, its sex drive, its pursuit of pleasure. And by following its desires, it makes mistakes and it gets into trouble and it gets cheated. And it learns from these mistakes and learns to apply them on the world, to hide the fact that it's a stupid animal and pretend to be more, well, human. And that's why I brought up the clown as well, because children laugh when they look at a grown person that behaves like a child, basically. Someone who can't walk, someone who misinterprets how to use tools of different kinds. Trickster as a character, Loke, Hermes, Anansi, Eshu, Legba. He is basically the incarnation of chaos in mythology.
Yeah, so Dionysius.
Yes.
I looked online about the trickster, and it talked about how the trickster is sort of exposing the people around to the collective unconscious, and how it can move on the border between the way we live and perhaps our unarticulated presuppositions for our culture. I think, opening up a conversation, because you are a comedian, how can a comedian be a trickster? Well, perhaps by exposing us to taboos, for example.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about your role as a comedian and how that relates to the trickster.
Well, I think we as humans, we exist in two worlds, both the animal world and the human world. And the human world is a world of culture, of myth, of superstitions, really, that we navigate through. And in the modern Western world, it permeates everything. So to such a degree that we take it for the real world. But the real world is more the animal world, where we exist in the now and where it's a eat or be eaten type of mentality, and where things are ruled very much by coincidence and chance. So I think my strength as a comedian is that I can walk between these two worlds. And when I started doing comedy professionally, this is 10 years ago, I started asking my new colleagues which two worlds they grew up in that made them be able to see the flaws in each world. And I remember one interesting example is a very famous comedian nowadays in Sweden, is Jesper Rönndahl. You probably know of him, your listeners don't. He had an interesting story because he seems so normal when you meet him. But he's an excellent comedian. And he said that he thought that it's because his mother is Danish and his father is Swedish, and they were married, and Swedes and Danes generally think that their cultures are exactly the same. But him growing up between his Danish mother and his Swedish father, he saw that they misunderstood each other all the time. And so he thinks that made him quite a good comedian when it comes to, because he always had a point of reference when it came to the culture he was taught being brought up in Sweden, and then contrasting that to what he saw visiting his Danish family.
And I mean, I can in some way relate to that because I grew up in a Christian family, and although Sweden is culturally still quite a Christian country, but it was obvious to me that my family were different to the other families that I had around me, except for in church. In that sense, I also kind of grew up into different worlds, and so did you, because you are raised conservatively Jewish.
Yes.
Yes. So maybe you can talk about that. How was it to grow up in Sweden in those two worlds?
I just want to say that one of the few things I like about my native country and culture is actually its secularism. But I grew up conservatively Jewish. It doesn't mean that we were necessarily very religious, but we were traditional because, in Judaism, you don't really have to believe in God or nothing. You just have to participate, basically.
Yeah, probably true in most religions.
Yeah. So, well, it gave me something. gave me a point of reference. I grew up with things in the Jewish tradition that I found quite good, critical thinking, discussion. And then things I found quite bad, like, you have to marry someone Jewish or hang out with a lot of Jews just because they're Jews, not because they're necessarily interesting or smart or funny. But I mean, that's basically true. And then you grow up with the Swedish things, and there were things in the Swedish culture I found quite appealing, the progressiveness, discarding of traditions in word, if not in deed, and equality and stuff like that. But then there were things I didn't like socialism and groupthink, fear of conflict, passive aggressiveness, conformity, anti-intellectualism. But my Jewish upbringing gave me something to rebel against because it was clear.
If you're raised in a religious setting, or perhaps if you're raised in a, I don't know, communist family or a fascist family wearing swastikas and so on, you are exposed to something which is perhaps taught to you as a true way of looking at the world. And so when you learn how to sort of rebel against that, to be critical towards your own upbringing and what you were taught to take for granted as a kid, it's perhaps easier to not just fall into, okay, so let's just become a social democrat and be like everyone else, because that's sort of the neutral way of life. At least my own experience is, I don't think there is a neutral way of life. When people asked me when I was younger, they asked me to explain myself.
Yeah.
Why are you a Christian? And I tried my best to explain why I was a Christian. But then I asked them the same question. So why are you not a Christian? Or what are you? What do you believe? Where does your ethical values come from? And so on. So explain yourself. It's like, I don't have to explain myself. I'm just a normal Swedish person. And I think that's sort of the advantage of having that religious upbringing, if you manage to break free from it.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about the Swedes is true, because especially when you look around nowadays where you have special interest groups, both Jewish, Christian and Muslim, who's trying to change laws or regulations in Sweden to accommodate their religious belief to a larger extent. And the Swedes don't know how to handle it because they genuinely thought that in truth their values were universal. Everyone had them even though they didn't say so. And now when they have to argue for their values, I'm thinking about, separate bath times for men and women at the communal bathhouse, for instance, they don't know how to argue. And I think it's going to be a big problem for them.
I think when Swedes have that universalized ethical view, I think that is sort of an outgrowth of a kind of Christendom history or tradition.
Yeah.
Because it's simply taken it one step further than Christianity traditionally did. It's saying now, okay, it's not as if God is this great lawmaker, but our reason is universal. And so if we just think properly, if we are people of reason, we can figure out what is good and bad. And of course, people assume that what they think is good and evil is, in truth, what is truly good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And don't really criticize that, but they simply put man in the place of God.
Yes.
But the logic is still the same. And so everyone else who doesn't agree with you needs to accommodate. They need to assimilate. And they're potentially good people, but they need to become like us. And so that's why our immigration politics doesn't really work very well.
No, well, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, getting into Swedish society is really hard because these things are taken as facts to such an extent that they don't feel the need to argue them. They think they're self-evident. Like you said about the American constitutions, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Yeah.
But if things are self-evident, you don't need to write them down, and the Swedes didn't.
I said that before we started recording, but I think in the previous episode I said something similar where I criticized the Declaration of Human Rights because its premise is a lie. It says it doesn't say created because you want to be sort of religion neutral.
Mm-hmm.
It says more we're born equal or something like that. And that's a lie. Look around. Some people are born in countries where there is no food and there's no clean water, and some are born like us. We never really need to be afraid that we're going to be hungry.
No.
So how is that to be equal? And as you said, what's your joke? If it was so self-evident, why did you need to write it down?
Yes. Why did you feel the need to write them down?
In Sweden now, we have an understanding about gender equality, and maybe you can talk about that, because I know you did a whole comedy special about gender.
Yes, I did. And I was trying to stay away from that subject for my entire career, because I think it's really hacky to do the difference between men and women jokes. I really thought that when I started out, but I mean, it's unavoidable if you want to talk about human existence, because there is obviously some sort of struggle going on between the sexes and within the sexes as well. So, the Swedes, they've taken this, that gender is just a social construct idea a bit too far, I think. What I said in my special was basically that if you think that gender is just a social construct, then you've never gotten a kick to your social construct, because that hurts really bad. But I think what Swedes have done is that, first of all, they confuse gender and gender roles continually. Gender, I think, in the Swedish language, then the word for gender is a biological construction and not a socially constructed thing. Gender roles, on the other hand, is a social construct. But considering the fact that every culture in every time and every place have had separation between men and women in garb or makeup, you can say that the need for separation between the sexes is also biological. Even though men might have worn high heels in the 1700s and women didn't, and now women wear high heels and men don't, the fact that it is separated says something about the human condition. And I think this is something that Swedes really, really don't want to see, which is that we are biological creatures. We're not inherently good. Stuff like this. And Swedes can't deal, I guess most people can't deal with the whole hard, cold truth, which is that we're, extremely limited creatures of biological origin. And then there's something in us that wants to be more. And sometimes it shines through, or if shines is the right word, I don't know. And if resources are abundant, as in the West right now, where I can have a hot shower, a vaccination, and a meal, and be safe, then it's easier to keep up the illusion that we're not apes.
And I think this whole conversation is also based on a notion of equality as a kind of universal truth about who we are. We're all equal. But Deleuze says that universals explains nothing, but must themselves be explained.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a bad ideal to have, or a strive for, that we're supposed to be, at least in the eyes of the law and politics, be treated equal. Even though it might be a lie, it's not a bad place to start. But to confuse that with reality is something else, and that's what Swedes are experts in doing. To take something that should be an ideal, that has very little to do with reality, and they just confuse it with reality. The ideal becomes the reality.
Perhaps that can take us back to the Trickster, because what the representational logic does is to impose an eternal code that rules our way of thinking, but it always ends up being oppressive because it is a reactive mode of thinking in the Nietzschean sense.
Yes.
For a trickster or a Deleuzian schizo, I think there's a connection there.
There is, because this is when the trickster needs to start working. You need to throw some gravel into the machinery.
What they have in common, for example, is that they refuse to reduce two contraries to an identity of the same. Because I think that is what the identity politicians are doing.
I see your point. I think women in Sweden are on the cusp, actually, of getting power. And when I say women, because here we come back to if the individual exists or not. Alexander Bard, for instance, he would say that the individual does not exist. Well, in that case, then he doesn't have to care on Twitter if some Iranian homosexual gets sentenced to death, because he doesn't really exist, so it's not really a problem. But it is a problem, isn't it?
I think Alexander would say that is a problem.
Yes, of course he does, because it would be insane not to care about it. And the same goes for like women and men in power. It's a very strange thing to say, because men are not in power. A few percent of men are in power. More than a few percent of women. But when I say that women are on cusp of grabbing power in Sweden, what I mean is basically a few women that has, basically the classic type of populist bully that have a lot of mindless, numbless nitwits following them and adoring every word they say. They will get the power. Most women won't get power. It can be useful to look in terms of groups when it comes to politics. But it can also be really, really stupid if you forget about the individual in those groups.
Another connected issue that Deleuze speaks about is the notion of difference, because I think that shows in this conversation about representational thinking. What Deleuze says about difference is a lot of things. They even have a book called Difference and Repetition. But one key aspect is that the normal way of looking at difference is that difference presupposes opposition. So if you are black and I am white, there is an opposition, and that opposition is the presupposition for talking about differences. But Deleuze twists that or inverts that and says that it is opposition that presupposes difference. In the sort of standard Western way of thinking, you end up thinking about differences as at war with each other. While I think with Deleuze, you end up in a way of thinking where differences are not necessarily seen as something that we need to conquer the other, but we can rather affirm each other. And so you end up in a Nietzschean affirmation of differences, or differential affirmation. And Deleuze picks up on that as well and says that the affirmation of every difference is the sort of presupposition for his formula that pluralism equals monism.
Yes, and I will join them with my own trickster philosophy of saying that if a society is very rigid, it needs a small amount of chaos. And if society is very chaotic, it needs a very small measure of order. I view my existence as a revolution, both an outward and an inward, against myself, what I believe, and what everybody else believes. So that's how I view myself, in opposition to other things.
I just want to read a quote from Nadia in Pussy Riot.
Okay.
After they did that protest in the church in Moscow, they got arrested.
Yes.
And in prison, she was exchanging letters with Zizek. She said about the sort of Apollonian and the Dionysian, which is what you were talking about, the more stale order of things and the chaotic. And she said one is not better than the other, but it is only together that we can ensure the world functions in the way Heraclitus defined it. This world has been and will eternally be living on the rhythm of fire, inflaming according to the measure and dying away according to the measure. This is the functioning of the eternal world breath.
Lovely. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm serious. I couldn't possibly have said it better myself.
Hence, we're reading Heraclitus, 2,000-3,000 years after he died.
Yeah, but he's the guy with the river, right?
Yeah, you can never step into the same river twice.
Yeah, well, I agree. And I'm trying to get this back to the trickster aspect.
But let me try if you need help, because I have an entry. The trickster is the one who doesn't accept this sort of binary code that rules us, but rather scrambles the codes. In your comedy, you have a joke that all black people look the same, except for Eminem. there's something special about him.
Yes.
It's a quite similar joke to one of Louis C.K.'s when he says that his least favorite word is the N-word. Not nigger, by the way.
Yeah, the N-word, yes.
And so some white lady on television is sitting there and she says the N-word and she's making me think it.
Yes.
And so you find that absurdity and you point to it, and you sort of, by making that move, exposes us to the absurdity of our whole way of looking at things.
Well, I hope so, because otherwise I would be a pretty bad comedian. I read a book a few months ago by Daniel Dennett. Remember him?
Yes.
Yeah, he was trying to solve the question of humor. He suggested, together with his co-author, that the comedian is like an antivirus program, basically, or a debugger for cultural programming. That when something becomes absurd in our value system, the comedian will shine a light on it and hopefully help to debug the prejudice that rules that phenomena. And I was way too flattered after reading to criticize him. I don't know. He wanted a complete answer to what comedy, laughter, and humor is, and I'm not sure he found one. But I liked that idea, you know?
Yeah.
Because what I do has a lot to do with critical thinking and getting people to think critically. I don't necessarily ask anyone to agree with me, and some of the things I say on stage I don't agree with. But there's a kernel of truth or something that questions in it, and then I say it anyway, because there might be something useful in the act of questioning. That's what I believe.
So, I want to keep moving a little bit, because we've mentioned Nietzsche. I know you like Nietzsche very much.
I do, because he has helped me as a comedian very much.
Yes, and that's what I want to talk about. So maybe you can first say something about how Nietzsche became a part of your life, but then also how Nietzsche is a source for inspiration when it comes to comedy.
Well, Nietzsche became a part of my life when I was quite young and narcissistic and thought that I was all that. And I read some passage from Also sprach Zarathustra, and I was like, yeah, that's me. So I was young, and then I grew up and I realized my will isn't that strong, and this is definitely not me. I started reading Nietzsche more as a comedian. Also getting into comedy and knowing what a rant is, for instance, when a comedian rages against a certain phenomena. Basically, that's most of Nietzsche's writing.
Yeah.
He rants. He rants against Germans or Polish people or religion or so. But what really helped me as a comedian, like practically, is his very simple notion of just turning things around, you know? Instead of love thy neighbor, hate thy neighbor. And doing that with human phenomena is very useful for a comedian, because you instantly, with a very simple mental trick, get to see what the opposite would be like. The opposite of something that you take for evident.
It's the deconstructive move in comedy.
Yes, most of the time. I mean, there are other tricks, but that's like the simplest one. And that's the one that sort of got me started. And also, that's the type of comedy I like, when people are against everything. Personally, I have like a small working principle in what I do, that I need to provide solutions to my audience. I'm not like a philosopher who just evokes the problem with a question. I actually, as a comedian, have to provide solutions. Of course, these solutions don't have to be practical in any way, shape, or form. They just have to be funny. Yeah, so I try to provide solutions to the problems I make fun of as well. But it's also part of being a comedian, or part of my comedy, at least. Not every comedian. When you're looking for things to suggest to people, when you have this enormously negative view of most of human endeavor when it comes to culture, philosophy, religion, statesmanship, sports, whatever, then you sooner or later, at least I did, I fell into the, stoned ape theory of evolution, Aldous Huxley, perennial philosophy, let's colonize space shit. But I mean, those solutions at least are funnier than most of the other solutions, like pray to God 5 times a day, or fast, or abstain from sex. So that sort of became my philosophy.
You say to be against everything, but at the same time, you also like the Elon Musks of the world who really wants to do something.
Absolutely. But if everyone was like me, I wouldn't be necessary.
No, and you want to be necessary.
I desperately want to be necessary. I know it's highly irrational, but yeah.
No, I think that everyone wants to. This comes back maybe to your emphasis on the individual. You want the individual to matter.
Well, politically, I think it's very, very important that we have an individual. Philosophically, I'm not so sure. Psychologically, I think we should have an individual. Religiously, maybe not. Because, I mean, religion is, for most people and most of the time, I think, an abandonment of the self to become part of something else or just dissolve into everything. At least that seems to be the tip in most religions to transcendence. But when it comes to politics and the real world, I think we need an individual. We need something that is the smallest part of the state, and that can't be a genome, I think, at least not at our current technological...
There will be patents for the genome in the future. It's already getting politicized to that level.
I'm sure, and in the West, I mean, when Buddha says that, you know, we don't really exist. We don't. It's, I mean, or if, I mean, I can explain that to myself in terms of biology, like my thoughts and feelings are basically just overproduction of survival instincts, right? I can say that, but I mean, politically, having an individual ensures each person in a society certain rights and hopefully certain responsibilities. And I think that's important. Can I ask you a question about affirmations?
Yes.
Or, you know, the affirmative. I don't really see that, because I think that if you can be negative against ideas and still produce things through negativity.
Yes. Yes, but Nietzsche's notion of the affirmation is it's not that as Nietzsche doesn't critique things.
No.
As you said, he rants on against everyone and everything. But Nietzsche's critique or his negation is always in the service of his affirmation, right? I don't know if you read it, but I have a few articles where I talk about catacombic theology in relation to cathedral theology. So I invoke a kind of dualism between the catacombs and the cathedral. It is a dualism that I invoke simply to challenge the inherent dualistic thinking that the cathedral mindset works with. But the critique is always in the service of the affirmation.
I agree with that, because I personally, I mean, that is my religion, is provocation and critique. I adore critique.
I think the issue is also that if you end up in this kind of slave morality that I was talking about before regarding these feminists in Sweden, that I think they're reactive.
They're making themselves into victims.
Yes, and they're reactive, and it's a kind of slave morality. I'm not saying every single feminist is like that, but on a larger scale, looking at the political discourse in Sweden, I think that
Sweden is a special place. I mean, you can, for instance, I did a search in international academic databases for references to Swedish gender studies. There's none.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, there's none. And we produce more gender study essays and theses than any other fucking nation on earth. And none of them are translated. It's because they're ridiculous. And they know that if they publish them in English, they would be critiqued severely.
But I mean, that sort of negative thinking doesn't change anything. Rather, it affirms the world that already is. So they're contrary to their own cause. And I think you can see this with leftism in Europe and in America, that you have this sort of safe space advocacy, you're language policing everyone. You cannot say that word, you must behave like that, you must be respectful towards these cultures in this way. And ultimately, some crazy fucker named Trump shows up and just calls them on it and speaks whatever is on his mind, and people find him liberating.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true about UKIP in England,
Yes.
the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, and the climate that created all these bastards are the leftists, which so many people take for granted. And that's why I think that people like deconstructive comedians are important, because it's perhaps one of the few professions that you can actually have where you can challenge this without losing your job. Because most people can see this maybe, but they're socially intelligent and understand that I need to pay my mortgage, I need to feed my kids, so I'm just gonna shut up about it.
I would go a step further, Joseph, and said that if I didn't critique these things, I would lose my job. Because that's my job. I don't know how it is in the United States because I live here in Sweden, but I get the feeling in Sweden that the ruling elites here, the establishment, the social democracy, or whatever you would like to call it, they have avoided serious discussion with serious opponents, and they always take Trump-like characters as an example of what their opposition is.
Yes.
And that is a way of silencing reasonable opponents to whatever system is in place. I'm talking about myself here again. Because
you can throw me in there too, because if you critique the one or the other, they always assume you're in the other camp.
Yes, they do, unfortunately. And here in Sweden, I'm pretty much considered, I guess, a liberal, which in Swedish means right-wing comedian. I'm not right-wing. I'm like super in the middle, liberal, classic, nothing, wishy-washy person. But in Sweden, I'm a crazy libertarian because the political scale here is so skewed for some reason.
Yeah, but at the same time, no one thinks you are a Swedish Democrat either.
No.
Which is our populist right-wing party.
Yeah.
So
that side hates me too.
Yes, and I think that's what happens, because if you live in this binary world that we've been talking about, the people who subscribe to it is simply going to believe, okay, so you are not with us, that means you're with them. It's an old Christian, I would say, idea that either you are in the church or you are going to hell. And there are equivalents in probably every other ideology and religion.
And culture, yeah.
Yes, but that's how it functions, because this is the order of that truly represents what is true and good and so on. And so if you're not part of that, if you don't subscribe to that, you're therefore a fascist or something,
yes.
You know? While in truth, perhaps it's that negligence against one's own presuppositions that actually leads one to fascism.
It does, and it also leads one to not be able to fend for one's values when faced with fascism in other forms.
Yes.
Because there's lots of fascism now, right? You have Islamism in the Middle East. It's a form of fascism, religious theocracy. That's what they want. And you have fascism in Europe in the guise of the Nazi party in Greece, or Front National, or the Swedish Democrat, or UKIP, as you said. But I see fascism also in the communist movements that are on the rise in Greece and Spain. Because all these ideologies, religious, communism, fascism, they focus so much on the group. And they deny the individual to such a great extent. And this is why I think it's so important to keep the individual. Because they focus on the group instead of the individual. And when you focus on the group, whatever the group says is right becomes right. Yeah. And you can't question it because you don't exist as a person. The group exists.
So if you have this groupthink, which is based on a specific or a particular group of individuals that resembles each other very much, and that sort of shapes what it means to be an individual, what it means to be an I in the group. The Deleuzean schizo can scramble that code because he is incapable of saying I. He is always more. There is an excess within the individual, which is more than the individual itself. So he can never be reduced down to that individual the group says he is. And that is why I think Bard tells you that the individual shouldn't have such a position in your thinking.
It was almost as if I understood something. I couldn't quite formulate it, but yeah, it was almost as if I understood something there. Still not sure I agree though. But you don't need to know what's underneath the water to sail an ocean.
No, and the thing is, Deleuze he says, you know, that's his critique against Freud, because Freud has this eternal code, the Oedipal triangle, mommy, daddy, me.
Yeah.
And what happens on the surface is always a representation in some shape or form of that eternal code. And so if you go to your psychoanalyst and you say, so my dad told me blah, blah, blah. And he goes, you talked about your dad there. Let's stay there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, talk more about your dad. And then if you sit for an entire session and you don't say anything about your dad, maybe he goes, you haven't talked about your dad today. Is there any specific reasons for that?
Yeah.
And ultimately, he's always looking for the dad because, as Deleuze says, Freud only finds the dad because that's the only thing he's looking for, because that's the eternal code. So if you talk about a tower, that's the father. Or if you're talking about whatever symbol, it's always that triangle he tries to find. And Deleuze says there is no such eternal code to try to represent. So he talks about reality as expression rather than representation.
Well, Freud's triangle, as my Freudian analyst has gathered by now, doesn't really apply to me because my triangle is me, me, and me.
So you're like an Irish man.
I guess. I don't know. What's an Irish man?
Freud said the only people that cannot be in psychoanalysis is the Irish. It doesn't work on them. They're too fucked up.
Yeah. Well, is it the Catholicism or is it the Celtic heritage?
I don't know. I'm not too familiar with Freud, to be honest. I've read some, and I know you talk about, what's the book you always name? Society and its Discontent.
Yes, I like that one.
Yes.
There's one I like even more, which is because it ties in with my Jewish heritage, is Moses and Monotheism, which I think I recommend highly to everyone. But I think Society and its Discontents is also very important to read.
Before this, I listened through quite a number of interviews with you. And it's funny how your Jewishness, how people in Sweden consider you as a person because you have a Jewish heritage.
How so?
Because
in your words, please.
In my words, I would say it's funny. Maybe you don't think it's funny, but it's interesting at least, you know, how there is sort of this underlying antisemitism that comes to expression in various ways. And so perhaps if you say you're Jewish, they would say, so you don't like Palestinians?
Yeah.
Because there is partly this idea that Jews and Israel is this one entity.
Yeah.
And so everything that happens in that region of the world, you have to in some way be responsible for. I saw another funny clip when Aftonbladet, one of the major magazines or newspapers in Sweden, had published an article about the theft of organs.
Yeah.
And you went there with with kidneys and hearts and turned them back.
Yeah.
Very funny, deconstructive.
Thank you. It didn't get much attention, as most things that has to do with mainstream anti-Semitism, because Swedes, they want to focus on the Nazis, basically, like extreme hardcore right-wing groups that hate Jews in a very obvious way, you know? But the everyday anti-Semitism that permeates Swedish society, they haven't dealt with in the least. And I don't think they're interested in it. And I think it's going to be a huge problem because they don't understand that they've taken in a huge number of Muslims now in the last few years. And within the Muslim society, there's virulent anti-Semitism at quite a high level, actually. But for Swedes, immigrants are just immigrants. It doesn't matter if they're Jews or Somalis or Iraqis or Iranians. They don't differentiate between different types of immigrants. So they can't really understand that there can be hate between immigrant groups as well. So do I dislike Palestinians? Well, I wasn't raised to love Palestinians. I would be lying if I said that. But and the Palestinians I've met, I haven't disliked particularly more or less than any other individual. I've met. But anti-Semitism in Sweden is it's quite hard to get at, and also because they really don't admit that they have it.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I didn't really want you to explain yourself what you think about Palestinians. That was just the example.
No. But I mean, I think Palestinians should get their own country, and I think everyone who wants their own country can get their own fucking country and see how much fun it is to have a country. But if you don't have a country, of course you want a country.
As long as everyone else has one, and I guess that might be an issue in the future where, the nation state doesn't really matter that much any longer. And so, okay, you can have your country because we don't care about that old paradigm anymore. We live in a more global world.
Yeah, but I mean, the Swedes would never give the Samic people their own country here, for instance.
I mean, they could probably have their own country if we could, use their mines and, the natural resources on their lands.
Yes, but in that case, it wouldn't be their country, so... But you've listened to lots of interviews and gone through my specials. So what's the verdict?
So my verdict of all your work, I think it's probably the best comedic work in Sweden at the moment.
Thank you. I don't think I have lots of competition, but thank you.
No, you don't. But the thing is, the comedians in Sweden, they're not tricksters, most of them.
No, I thank you. It was a very nice compliment. I haven't really looked at my production that intensely yet. And when it comes to stand-up, I spend a lot of time on it. But when it comes to podcast, I usually just go in and wing it. So I have no idea how people perceive me or how I should perceive me, even though I'm in analysis 3 times a week. I just seem to get more and more confused with each passing year.
Yeah, but I mean, because if a comedian sits down to write his or her jokes with the sort of collective unconscious in mind in order to please it.
Which is very common.
It's the opposite to what we've been talking about. But I do think there are many comedians who go that route, and it's easy.
But the laughters won't be as good. As a working comedian, we comedians, we know that there are many, many types of laughter. Yes. We have more words for types of laughter than, Inuits have for snow or whatever. I don't know how many words Inuits really have for snow, and it's probably just an urban myth. But what I'm looking for when I perform is involuntary laughter.
Yeah.
Because the involuntary laughter is real. I know it's real because it's involuntary. It's something you don't want to do, but it is forced upon you. So I like to describe my comedy where I have a goal in comedy, which is that my act should be like mind rape. And it's like being mind fucked, but it's not consensual.
Afterwards, maybe you come to the realization that this guy actually disturbed something in me that I haven't thought about. And in that sense, it might sort of evolve in other places in a non-comedy setting or in a non-comedy way.
Yeah, but that's my goal with almost everything I do. I mean, Kön, the special called Gender that I put up on YouTube, is basically it's about gender politics in specifically Sweden. And I want people to look at it and I want people to try and understand what I'm trying to say, because the amount of money we're spending now on completely useless policy is mind-boggling.
Yes, and I mean, you point in that special to a few contradictions within the sort of official narrative of Swedish thinking.
Yes.
So when you talk about is gender a social construction and the thing you said about getting kicked in your social construction, and then you go on and ask them, so is gender a social construction? And then you say, so homosexuality is a social construction, because they're not coherent in their way of reasoning there.
Yes.
And I think, my interaction with people from RFSL, which is sort of the high priests of gender thinking in Sweden, maybe.
They're definitely leadership in one of the cults.
But when I talk to them, it becomes clear to me that they are reasoning from a conclusion. So any kind of reasoning that leads to their conclusion is valid.
Yeah.
because it's the conclusion that matters. But the conclusion is static, it's final, it's ultimate, it's universal. Everyone should abide to it or by it. And that the outcome of that is that they're mirroring the kind of exclusivist behavior that they're opposing. And so if you take the issue of same-sex marriage, so in Church of Sweden, maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, they opened up for same-sex marriages. And so now it's all about inclusion. We need to include. And they're having trouble to rewrite their old books and stuff because they want an inclusive language. But my thesis is that the other side of the coin of inclusion is always exclusion. And so the trick is not to find a way to include everyone, but to start thinking prior to the distinction between us and them. Because if that line in the sand is already there as a presupposition for thought, you include, okay, so let's include all the gay people. Suddenly, you have to exclude all the people who don't want to include the gay people.
Yes, that is true. But you can argue that a point of view like homophobia is something different than homosexuality, because you can argue that homosexuality is a drive you're born with. It's a biological imperative in you. While a point of view can be changed, a biological imperative is much harder to change.
Yes, and the issue there perhaps is that it was the Christians who said you can change. You choose to be a homosexual.
Yeah.
And then the reactive move was to say, no, we are born this way,
Yes.
like Lady Gaga sings. And that created yet other problems.
Yes, it does.
And so I think, the Nietzschean way to approach issues like this is not to react against other people's views or politics or homophobia or whatever, but to affirm possibilities deemed inappropriate by them. That's also something that comedians can do, to show on another way. Deleuze's notion of the other, the philosophical concept, the other, is a possible world. And I find that interesting. So how to, rather than negating the people who are in power, which ultimately makes us mirror their behavior and become like them, we say no to them by affirming what they say is inappropriate or forbidden or doomed or whatever kind of terminology is being used for them, for that group of people. I mean, politically, of course, I think it's a good thing that homosexuals aren't oppressed. But was the aim from the beginning really that they should become like a nuclear family?
No, I don't hope so. All my gay friends have become very boring since they started becoming nuclear family.
But I mean, that's the outcome of this. You make a roast of a Swedish homosexual guy who's very famous, Christer Björkman.
Yeah, I did.
When you talk about him, you say that I thought all homosexuals were brilliant people and you are not,
Yeah.
And I thought that was funny. And I think he thought that was funny too.
Well, I think he appreciated my roast somewhat, at least.
Isn't that sort of the outcome of this political machinery, that ultimately everyone must become the same? So the homosexuals, they were deviants and they were seen as these disgusting people who are doing forbidden things with each other. And so the openness of society to say, we want to include you, we don't want you to feel dirty, ended up making not everyone who's homosexual, of course, but the sort of group of homosexuals are now expected to have kids, they're expected to buy a house, they're expected to be like me.
Yeah.
And if they want that, I'm not against it, of course, but I find it a little bit sad that the people who might actually be these tricksters to us,
they were hugged to death. Yes, I should be grateful that people hate me in this country, maybe. So I'm not hugged to death.
That would just make you one of the other comedians who are. You it depends, because it's hard to live like a trickster.
It is.
And I think that's, I don't remember if we recorded in the beginning when we talked about it, But being sort of having this as it must come natural almost. You can't learn, because ultimately you give up if you don't have it as a need. If your thinking is, so I can take this route in life and I can get a nice job and I can buy whatever I want and I can have that life, which is socially valued as something good. It takes quite a lot to say, I can't live with myself, even though that would be much easier.
It would be much easier, but also I know already when it comes to me, for me, it wasn't really a choice, because I don't really prioritize money and status in that way.
Yeah.
Of course, I have priorities towards money and status because I do what I do, but the money wasn't really priority number one. I'm definitely driven by my ambition and rage, a lot of rage, and also I think an affirmation of my uniqueness, or whatever you would like to call it. The feeling I have that I'm unique, that I want to be special. It's pathetic, really, but that is a driving force in me.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I would say that is pathetic. I would say that is what Nietzsche wants you to do, and what Deleuze wants you to do, because it takes strength to affirm one's own difference. Because if you are to affirm every difference, as Nietzsche tells us to, then you must affirm your own difference. And that is what is the most hard to do. It's easy to sit in a group and say, I affirm that group also, because you are among peers. But to affirm your own difference, that's going to be hard, because that means you are separating yourself in a sense from the others.
I've always used the argument that all the people in the in-group are also lonely. They just don't know it.
Yeah, do you remember I sent you a video of Peter Rollins?
Yeah.
Yeah, he oftentimes talks about depression that way. I'm not telling you that you should become depressed. I'm telling you that you already are.
Yes. So I just wanted to say something about, the things I said to Christer Björkman, who's famous homosexual and also Lord of Bad Taste in Sweden, because he's the manager of the Eurovision Song Contest here. And also about the Jews and Eminem and the black people and all those kind of jokes that like borderline racist or plays off of racist stereotypes. That this ties into what you said about the collective consciousness or the collective unconscious, because I couldn't make these jokes unless the premises were there.
Yeah.
And they are there in the collective unconscious, and I can just pick them up and make fun of them or deconstruct them. Even though people might not say the words anymore, they're still there, these archetypes or symbols or whatever you like to call them.
N-words.
Yes, and that is what I work with. So,
and I really enjoy it. So maybe we've talked for quite some time now. So we should end this, and maybe we can talk again.
So thank you for listening, and hopefully you'll hear more from me and less from Josef.
Yes, and you should check the show notes, at least if you're from Sweden, and I will link to some of Aron's stuff.
Absolutely.
I hope that you guys liked that. Aron is a fascinating guy, and I'm glad that I've gotten to know him. If you liked it, if you think what I do is worth your support, as I said in the beginning of the show, you can go to patreon.com/thecatacombicmachine. You can also go to thecatacombicmachine.com, where you will find links to Patreon, but you will also find articles and other things to read. I don't know exactly when the next show is gonna be published, because I might be busy. I don't know how the upcoming weeks will look, because I'm about to have my second child, so it's all a little misty and I have to plan as I go. But hopefully I'll publish something soon, within 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something like that. You can email me at thecatacombicmachine@gmail.com. Let me have it. If you didn't like what I said about feminism, let me have it, and I will take up your questions and I will respond to it on the show. How about that? So I'm not just gonna say stuff that might provoke you without offering you the opportunity to talk back to me. Email me and I will respond on the show. You can also ask other questions and you can suggest future guests and so on. Thank you so much for listening and have a good week.